Okay, hello everyone. I'm very happy to welcome Professor Jon Steinberg from the Austin Peay State University, all the way from Tennessee, and Professor Norman Saul has agreed to introduce Professor Steinberg. Before we do that, let me just mention three events that will take place at the end of September and at the very beginning of October. So next week, for those of you who are our faithful participants, there is no Brownbag lecture here on Tuesday at noon, but on Wednesday, September 25th, we have Professor Sergei Cherkassky from the Russian State Institute of Performing Arts deliver a talk titled Theater and Actor Training in Russia and the U.S., and this is happening at the Kansas Memorial Union at 4:30 on Wednesday. At the very beginning of October, we have two events. So on October 1st, we'll be back here, our regular time, Tuesday noon. And Professor Svetlana Vasilyeva-Karagyozova will give a Brownbag lecture titled Post-German Objects in Contemporary Migrant Polish Prose. And then on Wednesday, October 2nd, we'll have Professor Basil Machna in the Kali lecture series. And I don't know if you'd like to say a couple of words about that.
We probably should not call him a professor. He does have a PhD, and he is a former academic. Yeah, we should probably cross that out. But he is a creative writer. Basil Machna is arguably the most important Ukrainian language writer living in the U.S. today. He is originally from the Ternopil region. He was born in Charkiv. He then taught at the Ternopil University. He taught for a year at the Jagiellonian University in Poland. In 2000, he won a green card lottery and moved to New York City. He now lives on Staten Island. And for him, actually, moving to the United States really helped discover new aspects to his writing project, to his muse. So he has been a very prolific author of poetry, prose, and drama. He is best known as a poet. He has 13 volumes of poetry, original poetry, to his name, as well as several collections of translations. He won the BBC Ukrainian Book of the Year prize for a collection of short stories called The House at Baiting Hollow. Baiting Hollow is the neighborhood in Staten Island where he lives. And this week in Lviv, at the Book Forum, which is Ukraine's biggest book fair and literary festival, he's presenting his very first novel, which has just come out from Видавництво Старого Лева. And so we will be the first location after Lviv where this just published novel will be presented alongside his other work. So please join us for Vasil Makhno's reading on October 2nd.
Wonderful. And I'll ask now Professor Norman Saul to introduce our speaker.
Thank you. It's an honor for me to welcome back to the University of Kansas Jon Steinberg, who I knew as a graduate student and as an undergraduate student. He was here for 7 or 8 years in the 1970s and has gone on to many other things. He served as my graduate assistant for the first time I offered a course on World War I. And that's been his career. He went on from his master's degree here at KU to a PhD at Ohio State under Alan Wildman, distinguished scholar in that field of Russian military history. And we've kept up over the years at conferences and through his scholarly publications, which I'll pass around, and his editing work, which has been enormous on the Russo-Japanese War. There was a conference in Tokyo I remember distinctly, and celebrating the anniversary of the Russo-Japanese War. So it's easy to remember. It was 1905. And I remember his protecting me being much larger from the onslaught of commuters coming into the train on the station, subway station in Tokyo. And I thank him for that. Anyway, we've known each other a lot for the past years. And he will be talking today on the forgotten Treaty of Brest-Litovsk,
which I have since renamed the two treaties of Brest-Litovsk, indicating this is a project that is still living and breathing. But just as a way of background, because I think it's important to understand this, I was trained as a military historian, as I did my PhD. And I was trained by a man who approached military history through its social dimension. The reason why I'm sharing this with you is because that book is about education and training, and a person who was instrumental in my further development as a historian after the PhD was none other than Bruce Menning, who read the book, read the manuscript, said, "Yeah, this is pretty good, but we got to get you going on operational history." And Bruce is still very much, I'll put it like this way, inside my sport coat. Right now he's in Moscow, as you guys probably know. He always comes back from Moscow with another box of books saying, "You got to get this stuff read." And so I'm actually doing two projects. This is just one of them. And this one came to life because I am editor of a project called Russia's Great War and Revolution, something that Manya Carlson has become the official translator of. I just made you the official. Yes. And that's another word, a cautionary tale, and what we went through to get translations. Because we believe in publishing Russian scholars, and we believe they need to submit their work written in Russian, in their native language. Thinking, well, we would get translators, it wouldn't be a huge problem. So for those of you who aspire to become translators, you are needed desperately. But again, why am I doing diplomatic history? This is the big question, right? And I owe this all to Norman. Now, I can't remember the number of course numbers of the courses that I teach, but I remember distinctly taking a course called History 301, in which Norman Saul was putting together what turned out to be the beginning of a 4-volume effort. It's 4 volumes, right? On Russian-American, Russian-Soviet relations. And being sent to the library to find articles, because there was very little out there on the pre-Soviet relationship between the United States and Russia. And thanks to Norman, we now really we know this stuff now. Anybody can go to the library and check out Norman Saul and get it. So we're putting this project together in 2008 in Aberdeen, and everybody's kind of panicking over the fact that who are we going to get to write on Brest-Litovsk? This is World War I. We've got to have something on it beyond Wheeler Bennett's book, The Forgotten Peace. And I decided, well, I was once trained by a diplomatic historian, and this is the big mistake. I said, how hard can it be? Okay, that's the big mistake. I mean, and it has started this kind of like cottage industry in my life that the reason why it's still living is last year I was invited to go to Paris. All expense paid trip to Paris. Now, coming to Kansas is very nice, but going to Paris is a whole other thing. Particularly when you're married to a woman who was a French professor for 20 years. I was able to go home and say, "Baby, you want to go to Paris for a week in March?" One real big on that. But they were very interested in this work on Brest-Litovsk. There is a need to do it. And the reason why is because it is very complicated. It should not be known the history as the forgotten peace. So, without further ado, I'm going to move on here. I start here with these photographs of first the delegation arriving in December of 1917, and then Trotsky's arrival a bit later. And then the thing I want to take note of here is the sources all talk about, and these are primarily the German and Austrian sources, refer to the Bolsheviks as being these individuals who nobody understands. And one of the things they really criticize them for is the way they're dressed. And I don't understand that. Okay, there's still these cracks in the whole thing. Look at how they're dressed. Is that so terrible? Well, I guess by the standards of the time it was. They were expecting more decorum. And then what do the Bolsheviks come to Brest-Litovsk preaching, so to speak? They're preaching this idea of open or public diplomacy, that there should be no secrets. And this is something that dates back to, well, almost from the night they came to power. And they started publishing the so-called secret treaties between members of the Entente. And the first thing that they started to publish are the treaties, the Treaty of London, 1915, that gets the Italians to switch sides, and how they just blatantly, the British, French, but it was the British, blatantly promised the Italians control over the Adriatic Sea. Revealing these types of secrets also makes, I think, everybody antsy. The Germans, the Austrians, the British, the French, they're all kind of like, hey, there's a new kid on the block and we don't know how to deal with it. And what's even worse is we can't count on them playing by the rules of the game. I think that's appropriate to think about, particularly in the world we live in today. The inter-party struggle. Now this photograph, I am sure it was taken after the whole events of Brest-Litovsk, but I still like it because here you have Lenin, and there you have Bukharin, and there you have Zinoviev, and I'm sure that's one of Stalin's agents listening there. Yeah. Okay, now why am I showing this at this point? There is a titanic struggle going on within the party throughout Brest-Litovsk. And the titanic struggle is over whether or not to accept what is becoming an annexationist peace. And the Young Turks, that would be primarily the people circulating around Bukharin, of which Zinoviev was one of them, are saying we cannot accept this. We cannot accept this memberment of our western frontier, our western borderlands. And Bukharin is the one who comes out and says, what we need to do is engage in an asymmetrical war. He's calling it guerrilla warfare against the Germans. And Lenin just thinks this is insane, because he is the one person who understands that the Bolsheviks succeeded. And one of their greatest accomplishments of 1917 was destroying the fighting capability of the old imperial army. They had no army. And they're going into these negotiations with nothing but words and nothing to back it up with. And Lenin understands that the Germans, they still have their army and they're going to use it. And you don't mess around with a professional World War I era army. And Bukharin was just dreaming. He's going to end up writing left-wing communism and infantile disorder over this insurgency that's going on within the party. And so what I suggest here, and I'm trying to decide, it's actually in the article in the collection that's going to appear in the Schimmel-Pennant book, is what I suggest in this is that it's at this moment that the Bolsheviks are going to take on even more of an authoritarian twist in the way they're going to govern. And it's all about Lenin realizing that he has to seize control of the party in order for this surrender, this peace treaty, quote unquote, to happen. And so this struggle is going on not at Brest-Litovsk, but back in Moscow. And it's going to culminate after they signed the treaty, and Lenin's trying to get it ratified. So after March 3rd, 1918, when he calls together a meeting of the inner party and essentially says, either we accept this treaty or I'm going to resign. And like a good rabbi, he made that threat 3 times before anybody would believe him. And then finally the party relented and they do accept the surrender. This was a very unpopular treaty, obviously, across Russia. Even in, sometime in the 90s, if you remember, I wrote that review of all the books being published. My wife and I wrote this review of all the books being published on the Romanovs after the Soviet Union collapsed.
And one of them was Alexandra's diary. And I'm reading this diary of the what should we call her, the former empress, this tragic figure. And at the time of Brest-Litovsk, she's writing This is going to be what will restore Nicholas's reputation among the people, this horrible peace. They may even come and demand that he be restored to power. Well, you know, delusion's a wonderful thing. But it goes to show just how intense this was on the Russian side. If the Russian side was fraught with inter-party fighting, the German side was also. And so who you're looking at here is not Hindenburg and Ludendorff. But this is my moment to say the mastermind of the Eastern Front was a general named Max Hoffman. And there he is. He's the one who pulls the Germans out of the fire in August 1914. He is the chief of staff on the Eastern Front who masterminds the, what should we call it, the invasion of 1915. He is the individual who is always saving the Austrians. And he is the point person for the army at Brest-Litovsk in December of 1917, when the negotiations started. In the German army, for them it's very simple. You know, they're singing, we won because we won because we won. And when you win, what do? You annex territory. And according to European diplomatic tradition at this time, you also make the loser pay for the war. Okay, it's called reparations. And they knew the Bolsheviks had no money. The Germans probably had a better understanding of the Bolsheviks' financial condition than anybody else in Europe. I said probably, because this is, again, something that it's not really clear. How much money did the Germans give Lenin to overthrow the provisional government? It's a great story, but I still haven't read anything that convinces me much of anything except for a Ken Follett novel. This guy here, Richard von Kuhlmann is his name. He was the foreign secretary. And he is the first person to sit down with the Bolsheviks in December 1917. And his vision of the Eastern Front is that, now get this, what we need to do is recognize autonomous economic zones. He's very careful not to talk about nation states, but creating economic zones that will be loyal to Germany. This should be the goal. And he's the one who I think comes up with a very important point that the army completely ignores. And the important point goes like this. If we do as the army says and occupy, then we are going to have to leave German troops on the Eastern Front. The army doesn't want to do this. So their plan is, well, dysfunctional, non-functional. Okay, in the end, at least according to Gordon Craig, the German army is going to end up leaving 40 divisions on the Eastern Front after the signing of Brest-Litovsk in order to manage the occupied territory. And 40 divisions by World War I standards approaches 1.5 million men. Most of the sources talk about how Brest-Litovsk is signed and all that army goes to the Western Front. It's not true. Okay, what they did was they created an occupation regime, and one the Germans had to do because the Austrians couldn't. The Austrian army was broken during what we call the offensive, the Brusilov offensive. Okay, so we have this conflict that's going on between civil military in Germany. It's two different approaches to how to handle the peace. That's not going to be resolved until the beginning of February 1918, when the Kaiser has to finally step in and resolve the differences between his boys. And anybody want to guess how he's going to resolve the differences? I mean, was there any question, really, that he was going to side with the army on this? Because this is what happens, okay? In fact, at this point, the Kaiser doesn't know what to think of the foreign ministry because of shall we say, the failure of the unrestricted submarine policy that the foreign ministry had not really favored, but the Kaiser is blaming on them in February of 1918. Okay. Woe is Austria. We don't see a lot of pictures of Emperor Charles. Okay. So when does he come to power? It's December 1916 that Franz Joseph dies. After he comes to power in 1848. He reigns, what is that, 68 years? I married a woman who's real good with numbers, so I don't pay attention. This is a long time. And what do we know about this man? And the answer is not a lot. You know, there's no decent biography of it. It's like dealing with Nicholas II in the 70s. There was no decent biography of him at that time. That's changed, thankfully. But anyway, Charles is the emperor. And he has taken over an empire that is on its last leg. I always say to my students, we should call the Ottoman Empire the dying empire of Europe and the Austrian Empire the sick man of Europe. And it's very sick in the winter of 1917, 1918. It really, the Austrian army of the Eastern Front has not been restored since its defeat in the Brusilov offensive. In fact, what the Austrians are more concerned about militarily in the winter of 1917, 1918 is the Italian front. They've given the Eastern Front to the Germans. They've made it clear to the Germans as they go into Brest-Litovsk that the real issues are right here. These are the workers of Vienna in January of 1918 on strike. Here you see primarily children in bread lines in January of 1918. The empire is breaking down. Estimates, all the estimates, and I don't know where these estimates come from, but when you read through it, doesn't matter if you're looking at German, Austrian, or Russian sources. All of them say the Austrians have 6 weeks' worth of grain, and after that there will be a famine. That their grain supplies, and this is also to me very interesting, I mean, the Austrians were beholden to the Hungarians for their grain throughout World War I, and by the winter of 1917, 1918, the Hungarians aren't giving it up. Okay? And so the empire is grinding to a halt over the question of bread. Okay? Starvation is lurking. And you have this young man who, is he up for the task? As best I can figure out, he understands that he must do something to placate the nationalities throughout the empire. But beyond that, he's got very little preparation, skills, ability to deal with this. And then there is certainly a controversial figure, if ever there was one. Okay, go to Washington D.C. and at the Ronald Reagan Building, you can go to the Woodrow Wilson Center. And the last time I spoke to the deputy director of the Woodrow Wilson Center, he was like, you know, the politics of this is getting really hairy. Because of Wilson, the great progressive also was a great racist. But be that as it may, we do know, I mean, this is I think a pretty solid fact that on January 8th, 1918, he stands up in Congress and delivers a speech that we call the 14-point speech. Okay? Now, some sources will say he does this because on January 7th, the German army takes over the negotiations at Brest-Litovsk after a Christmas recess and lays out what they view will be the new boundaries between the German Empire and the Russian Empire, making it clear that this will be an annexationist peace. So some sources say he gave this talk in response to that. And I just wonder how within a 24-hour period, how much he understood what was going on at Brest-Litovsk. I mean, I know there were telegraphs, but CNN wasn't there. I know the Bolsheviks were preaching open diplomacy, but how well did he understand what was going on? And he didn't just pull the 14 points out of his hip pocket because the Germans had made this announcement. So I don't buy this trope which exists in the literature. This is something he had been working on that goes under, to me, the motif of his ability. What he wanted to do was negotiate an end to the war in which there was no victor. Okay, and this, of course, was just entirely unacceptable to the Europeans. I mean, you don't go through the resources and the human sacrifice that they've been going through since 1914 for there to be a war without any victors. Okay, so the other thing I think I take this opportunity to talk about is that the Bolsheviks all along had invited the British, the French, and the Americans to participate at Brest-Litovsk. And what they wanted to do was, I mean, Lenin's grand scheme here was, let's get them involved and let's end the war now. And of course, the British and French are nowhere near ready to end the war. They believe that they have a card to play. I used to call it a trump card, but I stopped saying it. They have a card to play. It's called the American Expeditionary Force. Okay? And they did, and they will. And it will have a dramatic impact, although I won't go so far as to say that the Entente wins because of the American Expeditionary Force, as some people like to say. But nonetheless, the Entente's not going to participate at Brest-Litovsk. And this goes to nobody trusts the Bolsheviks and what they're up to. Okay? And they're not ready to end World War I. And then I have this line up there, various shades of national self-determination, which I view as one of these deals where theoretically it's just brilliant. Everybody should have the right to be ruled by people who represent them. We expect that as Americans, don't we? Do we believe that's going on? Okay, did these guys actually believe that could happen? Because in practice, it's just far more complicated, especially in a confused borderland where there are a host of national groups that all expect to have their own state based on where their own people live. And when their own people live all over the place, it gets complicated in a hurry. Okay, and so to me, this whole idea of national self-determination it's a non-starter. It's going to be ignored in the end. And we could certainly argue about that one. And just a brief pause in the narrative to say, what are the sources here? Because of course, one of the big things is should I be going to archives and mining all this information, which I have not done? Yet the story continues to grow. Okay, and one of the reasons why I have not felt the need is because I'm overwhelmed with what's available. And available either at libraries in this country, mainly Illinois or the Library of Congress, or there's that thing, I'll never forget when an undergraduate walked in my office, showed me the internet and pulled up a viable source. It was a Native American memoir of World War I. And I was like, what? I mean, I had to go to the guy in our department who did Native American history and said, Alan, is this for real? And he's looking at it, the old guy's looking at it going, yeah, do you know what this means? Okay, and I'm looking at these young faces here going, my God, you guys will never have to go anywhere to do real research except to your computers. The open or public diplomacy first gives us a tremendous lens through which to view these events. But it means reading primarily Izvestia is where this stuff is appearing. And Norman, believe it or not, I thought of you as I was reading Izvestia, because you used to talk about the great paper shortage that occurred in the midst of the revolution. And so the Izvestia that's out there at this period is paper thin. It's like tissue paper. And even worse, I've never gotten my hands on the original copies. So I'm reading microfilms where you get the bleed through effect. Now, slowly going blind reading this stuff. Okay? But nonetheless, there's a story told there if you just read Izvestia from October 1917 to March. And I'm sure there's more beyond that, but I gave up then. Published document collections. The Soviets published a ton of this stuff. Okay, and of course they're the ones selecting it, and the Soviets always had their axe to grind. But I was taught that this stuff published during the Soviet period was you look beyond their axe grinding exercise and look for the information that's there, and it's there. Okay, and in addition to that, the State Department published a thick 3-volume collection of documents coming out of Brest-Litovsk. Where did I get it? I go online. There it is. Because I work at universities that do not have government document collections. And so I think it was University of Wisconsin put all of that turn of the century State Department stuff online. Still there. I checked it out last week as I was working on this paper I'm doing for the French. All of the primary actors leave memoirs. Unfortunately, the German ones are in English. I say that because I don't read German. which Germanists have really taken me to task for. They're convinced there's more to the story, and maybe they're right. I don't know. And we have one book on the Bread Treaty, and then Wheeler Bennett's book is still worth reading. And I hope that that book was published in the 30s at some time, so it's going on 80 years old. I don't know, Norman was passing my book around. I hope somebody wants to read it 80 years from now. I think that's quite, it's on the shelf. It's on the shelf. And then all sorts of Russian monographic sources, both Soviet era, post-Soviet era. Doesn't matter when it was written. This peace was a draconian peace imposed upon Russia by imperialists. Okay, so lots of sources that I still feel I can go back to and milk more information out of. If I ever get done with that and I haven't given up on this project, then I might actually, what archives would I go to? Personal archives? Look at Lenin, what he was saying. Lenin has about 25 volumes available online. 2 of them cover this period. All sorts of information. So we have to talk about maps, right? And what I want to say about maps is, this is what the Ukrainians managed to negotiate for themselves out of this Bread Treaty signed February 9th, 1918. And what really counts is right here. Okay? This little bit right here. Why does that really count? Well, look at the international boundary line here. Okay? Ukrainians request this little piece of land. We don't say the Bread Treaty is about annexation, but they request it, and the Austrians go along with it. And this piece of territory was ethnically Polish. And because of that, the Poles, who are desperately trying to form their own state in the spring of 1918, give up on the Austrians and the Germans. It's a key moment in all of this. Okay, and one that we don't pay enough attention to. So I'm glad you got here in time for the Polish paradigm, because that's where this story goes next, as far as I am concerned. I mean, this is one of the impacts of the Bread Treaty. The Bread Treaty was not just about this trade-off between the actors who say they're in control of Ukraine, and that's controversial as well, and the Central Powers, in which the Central Powers acknowledge an autonomous, independent Ukraine in exchange for the grain of the Ukraine. Sounds like a good song, right? That's going to feed Central Europe, that is starving because of the Allied blockade of the North Sea. It sounds good, but the question is, how do you get the grain? Yeah, you need transportation assets that have been blowing up after 4 years of war. You need cooperation among Ukrainian peasants who are, as Alan Wildman would say, more interested in eating the grain than giving it to anybody. And then you need some type of authority, because law and order has just completely broken down. Okay, and even worse, the first thing the members of the Rada, this Ukrainian government, asked the Germans to do is to come and help them, quote unquote, remove the Bolsheviks from their capital in Kiev. So, this Ukrainian government, ladies and gentlemen, signed this treaty which gets them independence and autonomy, and the first thing they do is they invite the Germans in to occupy their country. Yeah. Which will, by April, completely discredit that government. Okay? And then this is the second Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and this is the one that's more well known. And I'm going to show you a little more about this, but ladies and gentlemen, one commentator is going to say, I can't remember which one it is now, that it was Richard Robbins, who's out in New Mexico. I gave a talk at one of the Slavic conferences, and he stood up and he said, you realize when you look at a map like this that what the Germans did, and I said Germans and Austrians, is they pushed Russia back to where it had been at the time that Ivan the Terrible was trying to expand to the west. And then he pointed out that that's not very different, at least along here, what the border of Russia is today. So I think these are important considerations, but at the time, it's a draconian peace. The western borderlands have been taken apart. And there you see a Ukrainian delegate signing the bread treaty. And the response to the bread treaty was this. You guys heard this one? I guess I should put it in quotes. Neither war or peace. Now, this did not emerge strictly because of the bread treaty. This is something Trotsky had gone back to Moscow for when it became clear to him that the world was coming apart, that his words and all the stalling tactics on the planet were not going to prevent the Germans from doing this annexationist peace. And so this was the response. The idea was to buy more time. Lenin goes along with this because he's concocting this idea of we need to create a breathing space to figure out what we're going to do. Okay, and this is the beginning of the shift of Soviet foreign policy from worldwide revolution to socialism in one state. And now I'm going to go back to my Kansas roots and say, where's Roy Laird when you need him? Because he was the political scientist here who taught me all about Soviet foreign policy. And everything he taught me is bearing up through this research years later. Okay? So a lot going on. I mean, Trotsky famously stands up and does this, and the German response to that was, okay, now we're going to mobilize the army. They don't say that for another week, so the Bolsheviks have a week in which they think, hey, this is working. And then on night of February 17th, February 18th, the German army goes back into operational order. And the line of demarcation keeps being moved further east, and Lenin keeps saying, see, guys, there's no stopping this. If we do not capitulate now, we won't have a revolution. And that's how ultimately he gets his way, is the Germans have to start fighting the war again. And then there is the Austrian foreign minister, who I think his memoirs, now this is a man who is in and out of various psychiatric hospitals at this moment in history. He's massively depressed. He understands there's no future for the Austrian Empire. And so he is the one who is telling the world, watch out for the Bolsheviks, man. These guys cannot be trusted. Okay, and his memoir is very important for that as well. And I was happy I found a picture of him, so I thought I should put him up there. And then another map showing you territory lost. And as I'm feeling a pinch for time, I think we should go to this and just look at the economic hit that occurred here. I mean, European Russia is dismembered. And this, I think, is becoming a tradition for peacemakers in 1918. 1919. That is, these ridiculous peace treaties that destroy the economic viability of a country. It happens here in March. In June of 1919, it's going to happen to the Germans. And I maintain that at least part of what's going on here. I had a wonderful conversation in Paris last March. The French really like to talk about it had to be done because of the emotion. How Clemenceau makes sure that these maimed French soldiers are at Versailles on June 28, 1919. So everybody knows why they had to stick it to the Germans. And I maintain that Wilson in particular goes along with this because the Germans stuck it to the Russians at Brest-Litovsk. If they could do it there, then I guess that legitimizes doing it here. Okay, again, Brest-Litovsk plays a huge role. Now, what happens at Versailles with Brest-Litovsk is the first thing they do is they discard the treaty. They say, well, the Germans lost, so that treaty doesn't count. Proving Lenin correct again. See, we bought that breathing space. They lost, and now, well, we can take over all that territory there. Okay, of course, it wasn't that easy, right? Because what is going on in Russia in 1918, 1919, which I haven't even said yet, but plays a huge role in all of this, and that's the Civil War. It's just consuming Ukraine. And there you go. What happens in Ukraine is you have the Ukrainian People's Republic. As you see here, it's proclaimed on the 20th of November, 1917, and you can say it exists, if you will. It just depends on how you want to look at things. Until April of 1918, when the Rada is ousted essentially by the Germans to establish a hetmanate because they need the grain. And the Rada can't deliver. So the Ukraine now is put in control of, or given control to this character here, a guy named Skoropadsky. And there he is. He's going to deliver the grain. And so Ukraine just becomes occupied. Okay, and now it's a question of how much grain can the Germans actually gain control over. Yeah? Yeah. And again, as I said, they're not going to gain control over much. I've tried to find a number. That's another fascinating story, is grain markets throughout this region of the world, 1917, 1918, 1919, up to 1921. Try to find anything on that. There's stuff out there, but it's just really scattered. And I haven't been able to, like, in my mind, put together the big picture. And so now we get to what some sources refer to as the tragedy of the Ukraine. It is surrounded. There are at least 6 armies that go through Ukraine in 1918, 1919. Ultimately, Lenin's idea of national self-determination dies in the Ukraine. He has to admit that Ukrainians should have their own country, but we need their resources. Frankly, what did we used to call it? The breadbasket of Central Europe, right up until this planet Chernobyl melted down. And so that was good until the 80s. And so all I'm trying to show here is how the Civil War goes raging through there. Let's not forget intervention, another story that is wrapped into all of this. I mean, what were we doing in Russia in 1918, 1919? There are explanations, and then there are explanations. The Civil War has at least 3 different armies go through the Ukraine. What's almost impossible to try to come up with a number on are the peasant rebellions. And this goes back to, they're the ones who are growing, they're planting, they're harvesting, and they're eating the grain. And, go talk to a Kansas farmer about who controls his grain right up until he sells it. This is very personal. This is their livelihood. And then the extreme violence. We've all heard of the Frey Corps. Yeah? And I deliberately showed these guys here. These guys are looking pretty good, right? They're marching through Munich. What does it say there? May of 1919. The Frey Corps, certainly a harbinger of things to come for the Germans. Paramilitary, right-wing extremists. They grew up on the Eastern Front as civil order broke down there, as they were being ordered to retreat. And then the movement spreads across Germany, beginning with the German Revolution in November of 1918. And they stay around, long enough to witness the emergence of the Nazis. And you can find more than one source that says they are the guys who provide the early backbone of the Nazi Party. And they too are not just in Ukraine. In fact, I would say they're more operational in northern Central Europe, in the Baltic states, where they believe there's this kindred spirit of Germanism, if you will. Okay. So the grain issue and the violence remains, and there's just no way around that. And so this is why, what did we originally say? Oh, the bread treaties. Sometimes I say peacemaking in the East was not peacemaking at all. Okay, it was just a transition from World War I to all this other extreme form of violence that came with the emergence of all of the states of Central Europe. And I say Central Europe because I go to Poland every summer now, and the Poles are really, they don't like it when I refer to Poland as Eastern Europe. They say Eastern Europe is further east. It's not us. We're Central Europe. I don't want to get into a nationalist argument here, but I remember having that conversation with a woman named Anna Chinchawa in 1976, So. All right, and then ultimately, all the violence leads to a breakdown of production of foodstuffs. And the famine that follows, I think again, here's another KU memory. Having Roy Laird say that the Soviet government would not have survived without food relief led by the Hoover administration, if you will. And I don't know if Norman would agree with that. Yeah, okay. So anyway, the show, I tried not to get too gruesome, but the end result of all this peacemaking was the complete breakdown of civil order and famine that is spreading across Europe. I particularly like this map because it says Germany is unclassified. I think that tells you everything you need to know about the bias that goes with this map. The Germans are starving in the aftermath of World War I, and it's even worse in Austria. And to say unclassified when all around it you have famine conditions, I think we know who made the map anyway. And so all of this is supposed to stop with the Treaty of Riga, a whole nother story, if you will. The Treaty of Riga is going to establish interwar Poland's boundaries and create this multinational state that the Poles simply found unwieldy. And sources will tell you that this is the end of this period of violence in the area, but I don't buy that at all. I think it goes on well into the 20s. And if there was a brief respite, it may have occurred in the late 20s. But by the early 30s, Stalin is at it in Ukraine and transforming that world. And another famine, a very famous famine, occurs at that point. So I just don't see any peace in this region of the world for any period of time between the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and really the end of World War II. And even then, you look at the end of World War II, and they don't stop fighting with each other there in 1945. Okay? And so this is just designed to sum things up, and I think I've said this all one way or another. And I know we're supposed to end at 1 o'clock, and I'd like to open this up for some questions at this time. So, I mean, you can read the slide. I have another one after that on why this should not be the forgotten piece. I hope after this presentation you will agree with me that the last thing we should look at Brest-Litovsk is a forgotten piece. It needs to be resurrected. I don't know if I'm going to be the person to do it. I seem to just keep publishing articles on it and really have no time to do a book on it because I owe Norman an annotated for this series here, in case you don't know about that. And I owe another publisher a book. It's just never ending. So, I will stop here and turn it over to you guys. Thank you.
Are there any questions?
If I may comment as somebody who is not a historian, but as somebody who is fairly familiar with, the narrative within the field of Ukrainian studies. So some of the elements of what you present there would be a strong pushback if a Ukrainian specialist historian were here in this room. One of the things is in January of 1918, we have Russian Bolshevik invasion and taking over Kiev by Muravyov's army. Mm-hmm. So Radas asking for help to repel Muravyov is not as surprising and puzzling and would not be seen as controversial as you're making it out to be for many people would argue, because the Bolsheviks do start with that incursion. There was no Ukrainian incursion on Bolshevik-controlled Russian territory. It was the other way around.
Two things. One is, when I was here, there was a Ukrainian librarian named Michael Peay. And as I was putting this together, I thought, I couldn't say this if he was here. So you're living on in his spirit. The other thing I'll say is, maybe I came off too strongly. In a moment like this in the nation's history, choices have to be made. Okay, and the point that I am making, though, is the point that I want you to dwell on, is that by April, the Rada has no credibility because of this decision that was made in January.
I don't think it is because of this decision. We basically had a government whose first president was a colleague of yours, a professor of history, Mikhail Hrushevsky. And and this is a government which at first was advocating for full autonomy and did not have a standing army. So a person who, in the earlier years was a theater critic, Simon Petlura, eventually becomes a military leader, which is also a bit of an unusual turn of things. So it was a theater critic, a very successful, respected theater critic.
That. That's great. That's great stuff.
Germans orchestrating a coup and installing Skoropadsky, they install a Korean military person as a conservative autocratic ruler after this centrist social democratic government, which was trying to be peaceful and lovey-dovey, and then got invaded by the Bolsheviks after they've been trying to negotiate in good faith. The story is just a lot. There are many more layers that are complicated, and this also brings me to share some sad news. I'm not sure if people in this room have heard. Mark von Hagen, who was a guest here as a keynote speaker for a conference held in 2017, passed away on Sunday after a long illness. And Mark has been working on Ukraine during World War I and the struggle for independence in 1917-1921. So there is a small book he published on the World War I part. But
he also published an article last year that he shared with me in manuscript form, which Mark was a brilliant mind, there's no question. It was a huge loss to our profession. He was a young man, as far as I'm concerned. He wasn't that much older than I am. So what I want to tell you is that Mark read everything I wrote about Brest-Litovsk to this point. He was very encouraging by it. And so what I want to say is that I appreciate your characterization of there are many layers to the story, and that I'm not telling you should go and read all my stuff on Brest-Litovsk, but I am.
I'd like to, actually. I'm interested.
I am cognizant of it, and losing Mark's voice as a critic is a big deal, because he was the one who was imposing those. I mean, look, I started this as this was going to be a simple project on the Soviet engagement with the world at Brest-Litovsk. And then all of a sudden I was dealing with Ukraine, which I had never dealt with. And so ironically, it was Mark who I went to, because I'd known Mark since the 1980s. And he was always very supportive and encouraging of anybody. And so he was a tremendous help in getting to this point. So, but we have a question behind you.
Thank you. Just a really interesting presentation. You mentioned at the outset that you sort of didn't see yourself at first as a diplomatic historian, but really got into it. And I'm kind of curious what you make of, there's a historiography of sort of the evolution of the Soviet Union from this open diplomacy to a state that's kind of acting like other states in the international arena. And I'm wondering where or if you see the end of open diplomacy, because in the narrative you presented, you see a series of pragmatic and very painful decisions ultimately made by the Soviet state. So does open diplomacy ever really sort of mean anything more than dressing in clothes that are moderately less formal and publishing some things?
Publishing everything.
Does it have an after history after Brest-Litovsk, or is it sort of a very short-lived kind of thing?
That's a great question, and one that I really haven't given much consideration to, because I look at it as public diplomacy fails at Brest-Litovsk. They don't accomplish anything they set out to do. And then they're consumed by the Civil War. And as they come out of the Civil War, what's so critical for the Bolsheviks is trying to gain some support somewhere in the world to open up commercial relations. And at that point, it's 1921, and Lenin is in as control as he is going to be, and he has made it very clear that we have to play by their rules. So I'm going to say right now, without even doing much deep reading about it, but my sense is that this is public diplomacy's greatest moment. And it ends in a big hurry because they learn that, well, they're not going to manipulate, which is what they're trying to do. They're not going to manipulate anybody with these tactics. So I would say it's really dead by March of after this is over. And then you know what I would have to do to follow up on this is try to find an example of where they engage in some type of public diplomacy after Brest-Litovsk. And off the top of my head, I can't think of that place. But, you know, like I said, I haven't done much thinking about it. So.
5 minutes if there's another question.
What was going on? I study Estonia, and so you know the treaty. What was going on, and you know the Estonians declared independence March 24th, February 24th, 1918. And right after they declared independence, the leaders had to go back underground because Germans attacked. During this treaty negotiation, were the British and the French and the Germans not fighting right now? Was there?
You mean on the Western Front?
Yeah.
Well, first thing I want to tell you is that, ironically, the reason why I ended up with this bend, if you will, in this project was because of a famous Estonian historian. I think he's famous anyway. Olavi Ahrens, who Olavi and I have been. Olavi taught in Savannah, and I taught in Statesboro, Georgia.
We were at a conference with him in Gdansk just in June.
He came and saw me in Krakow before he went to that conference, and I mean he's really big on taking this into. He wants to do another big collaborative research project on peacemaking in emergent states in what are we going to call it, Central Europe after World War I. And I'm sitting here going, you know, this would be the third one in my life, and I'm just not going there enough. So ironically, it's Olavi who got me going on this. And in actual fact, there's not much going on the Western Front in between November and February, well, I should say March of 1918. I think everybody's holding their breath to see what's going to happen with these negotiations. I know the French are playing a rough and tumble game with the Americans over the question of, can we take American units and throw them willy-nilly into the line, or will the American Army fight as a integrated unit? And we know that in the end, the American Army was pretty much held together. Some units went in March when things got really desperate. But it's not until, June, July of 1918 that the Americans go on the offensive, down by Verdun, essentially. So to answer your question, yeah, there's not much going on at this moment. And I think it's because they're waiting. It's the dead of winter. This is the moment in World War I when you tended to resupply. You tended to work on training soldiers for the spring campaigns, which I think you would find to be the case every, dead of winter months. Usually fighting would die down October, November. It's kind of like the ebb and flow of things. The other thing I will say to you is no matter where I go with this stuff, I'm always dealing with these Western Front historians who just act like the Eastern Front didn't happen. The Eastern Front was huge. And the thing that really kills me about it is the Eastern Front is where the war maneuver that they all trained for in the build-up to World War I actually happened. Yet the Westernists, if I can say that, and you understand what I'm talking about, they all was like, oh, well, that was there. Did they have airplanes? Does it matter? I mean, these are the type of questions I get in the 21st century. I just find it, I find it incredible. Eve, did you have a question?
Well, I actually had a comment. It's sort of one of those things about how patterns repeat. A number of years ago, I had an undergraduate who did an honors thesis with me here at the University of Kansas. And he was interested in who the East European experts were who were advising the Wilson administration about the Treaty of about the Versailles Treaty, and discovered just how paltry their information was. The people who were their experts had no expertise to speak of at all, and they were the ones advising the Wilson administration.
And the immigration had a big voice.
Yeah, a lot of
Yeah. But I'll tell you a great story from Olavi is he did this. Who was Wilson's expert on Estonia? Ready? His name was Samuel Eliot Morrison.
Right.
Have you guys ever heard of Samuel Eliot Morrison? If you haven't, there's like a 15-volume history of the U.S. Navy in World War II written by this guy. Morrison resigns in a fit because Wilson won't listen to him. And this is the best part of the story. At the time, he was a professor at Harvard. And so it goes back to Harvard. What are we going to do with this young man who won't play by the rules? And in the end, they kept him because, well, they viewed him as a good teacher. So stick to the teaching, guys. That saved his butt in 1919. But no, it's a great story because what was Samuel Eliot Morrison's expertise on Estonia? You know, he wrote a great book on Christopher Columbus. Right. He did. He did all that stuff on the Navy, and he did some great stuff on the Age of Discovery, right? But what has he ever written on Estonia, Eastern Europe, Central Europe? Did he know the languages? But I mean, that's a very good point.
Yeah.
Wilson had Colonel House, who in the end, he stopped talking to, which is another bizarre story. I mean, the colonel tried to get on Wilson's good side until the week that Woodrow Wilson died. And Wilson stopped talking to him during the negotiations of the Treaty of Versailles, never spoke to him again. And I don't know why he was a colonel.
You mentioned that the Austrians weren't interested in the Eastern Front after the revolution, the Russian Revolution, but the Italian front. And I wondered, did they put a lot of troops from the east to the Italian front? Because I'm always wondered, it's 9 or 10 battles in the zone, so and yet they broke through. No, the Italians were dreadfully led, but enormous losses. So did they transfer a lot of troops from the east to the...
You know, I at one point tried to chase that down. And what you run into is the Austrian army of the Eastern Front was decimated during the Brusilov offensive, and its fighting integrity was never restored. So what do you get from that? I don't think there was a lot there that they could transfer from the east to the west. Okay, but I don't have any hard information. Some young student should do the research.
Italian losses, and the front was stationary, and in the end it's the Austrians that broke through.
Yeah. And in fact, the U.S. I had a student down in Georgia who was doing this honors thesis on American troops sent to Italy in 1918, so the Italian nation wasn't overrun by the Austrians. That was very interesting. Of course, he wrote this to prove that the Americans saved the day, and I never know whether to believe that or not. But directly, I don't see Austrian troops from the Eastern Front being moved to the Italian Front, not in any substantial numbers. There's always some, particularly within the officer corps. Yeah.
We'll have to wrap up, so thank you very much for coming.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.